Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with some practical thoughts on collecting historical recordings. Now, this is a topic that's a bit controversial when it comes to classical music because, as usual, the definition of what constitutes a historical recording is kind of unique. It's special when we think about classical repertoire. And the reason I'm talking about this is because in our other set of videos about the most important recording projects ever, we were discussing recently Arthur Schnabel's Beethoven Sonata recordings from the 1930s. And there ensued in the comments a whole discussion, as there always will, about which version of them sounds best and what kind of reprocessing or remastering gets used to make it tolerable, and whether some people can listen to early piano recordings and others can't stand it. I mean, it's a serious issue with classical music for the simple reason that everyone's doing the same stuff. And why would you want to hear the same stuff in horrible sound when you can get it in better sound, done just as well? See, that's the point. So I'm going to begin with a dogmatic statement. That statement may be contested by some, but it is a dogmatically true statement. There is no work of standard repertoire available in a historical recording that you cannot get in better sound in a modern recording, in a performance which is just as good. That's the thing that's going to freak some people out, the just as good part. Because some people really just love earlier performances of something. And to say, well, I love X's performance from 1935 of Beethoven's Fifth, and it can't possibly be just as good as the one from 1975 or 85 or 95, because I like that one better. Well, I always have to come back to this. It's not about what you like, because nobody cares what you like, and what you like isn't important. What we're talking about is the quality of performance at a reasonably objective level of understanding. Because we can never be completely objective about these things. There are always going to be the versions of something that speak to us more than any others. But that has nothing to do with quality. That has to do with whether it speaks to us more than any other. It's just a subjective impression. But there are generally acknowledged consensus type great performances of most works that are very early and that are very late, and or modern or more modern. And so there is never any reason to sacrifice quality of sound for quality of performance. Now, whether or not you're going to love it, I don't know. I can't know. That's why I don't care. But as a general principle, this is true. So if you're starting a collection, and that's really what I'm getting at here, and the people I'm talking to are those starting collections, never be fooled into saying that such and such's version is so uniquely, specially, wonderfully fabulous that you can't hear just as good a version done by somebody else. You can, and you will. Whether you'll respond to it or not, I don't know. That's for you to decide. But when you're beginning a collection, when you're starting to get to know a work, it is an axiomatic rule that you are always better off getting a performance in really, really good sound than one in less good sound. Because you've got to know the work. You've got to hear the work. You've got to understand the work. You're not going to hear it. You're not going to get the experience of it. The great conductor George Szell made a very interesting comment. And it was one that I think is worth taking into account when we consider historical recordings. What he said was, if I had a choice between two conductors, one of whom was incredibly communicative to the orchestra and charismatic and had a magnetic personality, but wasn't as musically prepared as another who was extremely thoroughly prepared, who understood everything there was to understand about the piece, but who may have had difficulty with conducting technique per se or communicating this to the orchestra, I would always go with the latter, because eventually the latter will learn what to do. But the former, if they don't have the grounding, if they don't have the fundamentals, they're never going to acquire them. And the essence of his point is that, George Szell himself was considered to be something of a cold fish, somebody whose recordings, when they came out, were sometimes a little bit stiff and unyielding, but over time, their unbelievable emphasis on fundamental musical values, when captured in good sound, has made them historical phenomena, has made them iconic. And the same thing is true when you're getting to know a piece of music. If you can't hear it, in its best audible form, you will never know what that piece of music is supposed to sound like. And in that sense, I have encountered people in my peregrinations through the classical music universe. I have encountered people whose knowledge of music has been polluted, poisoned, because they encountered or insisted that they must start listening only to historical recordings, which is, that's a cult phenomenon. That's a craziness, I understand. But there are people who do that, and it's toxic because it prevents you from hearing later performances and enjoying them when you actually are getting the information you need to know about what a piece of music actually sounds like. Now that we've established that principle, the principle of never begin with historical recordings when you're learning or getting to know a piece of music through recordings. Now that we've established that, we have to really refine our definition of what a historical recording is. Because, we talk about recordings all the time that were done in the 40s and the 50s. They sound marvelous. Especially in the 50s. They may be in mono, they may be in stereo. We just talked about Antal Doradi's mono recordings on Mercury Living Presence, in absolutely fabulous mono sound, or very typical mono sound for that particular label, which was an audiophile label. I had no problem with them being mono. Other people in the comments did. I had no trouble with the sound of the Schnabel Beethoven cycle in the Pearl remastering, that is, with a lot of the pops and clicks left in. Other people did. It has nothing to do with when a recording is made. Let's get rid of the idea of historical recordings being time sensitive. Some recordings will always fall in the category historical because they were like acoustic. They all sound bad. But what matters is not when it was made. What matters is what it sounds like. The criterion is quality of sound reproduction, not date. Because also in the realm of historical recordings are modern recordings that were unauthorized by the artists in question. The person above all persons in that category is Furtwängler, who made virtually no studio recordings, or very few. And most of his stuff is live. Most of them are air checks. Most of them are abysmal sounding. Most of them are abysmal as performances. They were never authorized by the artist in question to be released. And so these unauthorized broadcasts, they're usually broadcasts. Sometimes they're tapes made discreetly by somebody with a microphone up their sleeve, sitting in the audience, and so they just sound horrible. But it could be either way. But these unauthorized recordings, or broadcast recordings, or whatever they are also considered historical. Some of them can be in gorgeous stereo. So there's a wider definition of historical. My definition, the one I want to use for our purposes, is historical means things that sound like crap. in a nutshell. Things of questionable sonic provenance. Because that's really the issue. The issue is whether or not you're going to prefer something that sounds terrible to something that sounds marvelous. And like I said, in the world of classical music, there is no reason to ever have to sacrifice one quality for the other. It's not a zero-sum game. People who are dyed-in-the-wool historical recording enthusiasts insist that it is a zero-sum game, that nobody will ever equal the spiritual authenticity and whatever of performer X. Well, that's bull, quite simply. That's a personal opinion about a particular performance, often tied into a cult of a particular performer. And so the issue of whether a recording is historical or not is really a subterfuge, a substitute for the I love this artist no matter what they did and no matter how bad it sounds, and I don't care. And if you don't care, that's fine, but admit you don't care. Let's not make it a general principle of liking bad sounding recordings from a certain era. I mean, that's a little bit, I think, ingenuous. I really do. And the rest of us, I think should be smarter than that. I've been through this so many times. You have no idea how in the world of classical music you run into folk who are just dyed-in-the-wool historical recordings nuts. Now, it can be so much fun to investigate historical recordings. Some historical recordings are historically important because they represent certain performance traditions. But there's a huge difference between the uniqueness of a performance, which is a generic quality, because every performance is unique. No performance is exactly like any other performance, ever, of anything. That's always true. But that doesn't equate with quality of performance, number one. Quality of interpretation, which, as I said, is often a very subjective quality. But beyond that, it's a question of what you actually hear, how good the sound is. And one of the things that really is important is it depends on what kind of music you're listening to, because certain things come away better in bad sound. My opera people, the voice people, a complete separate subset of the classical music loony bin. I mean, it's fun loony bin, granted, but they are in love with certain voices of certain artists. And as far as they're concerned, an opera is a thing for people who sing, which it is, of course, voices and only voices. And the orchestra is just this sort of accompanied thing in the background, and nothing that it does matters, or the conductor doesn't matter, and none of it matters. All that matters is the voice. Well, early recordings tend to capture individual voices rather well. I mean, enough so that you can hear their individuality. You could certainly hear the words. You could hear the individual artistry of the singer in question and what they do, and compare that to other singers. So you're in pretty good shape when it comes to solo vocal recordings. You can go back further. It's also true with certain instruments. If you're a violin nut, for example, or a piano person, you can get back pretty early and have a pretty good sense of what's going on. Orchestral recordings are another matter entirely. If you're listening for the orchestra, opera recordings have an orchestra. But if you don't care, well, there you go. I care. I care about orchestras. I care about what the composer wrote. I want to hear what the composer wrote. In earlier recordings, you get to a point where basically all you hear is tempo. You could tell the tempo and maybe some things about phrasing. There are no dynamics. They're squashed down to nothing. The texture is clogged and clotted. Whole swaths of the instrumental timbres that the composer intended are either completely distorted or totally inaudible. I mean, I remember so vividly listening to Elgar conducting his own Second Symphony, which is really a very fine performance in terms of phrasing and nuance and tempo. We learn a lot about how he expected the work to go. But at the climax of that third movement, the climax where he talked about it sounding like you have a pounding headache that won't stop and it's driving you crazy. And he has this enormous crescendo for the whole orchestra. Huge. And you have to hear the trombones coming out and the timpani, and pounding in the back is a bass drum and snare drum and tambourine going bang, 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 bang. Totally inaudible. Cymbal crash, barely there. It's not even there. So the entire sense of the music is lost, completely lost. And in fact, one of the things that's, I think, most deceptive about the discussion of historical recordings is that people who love them and have heard later recordings are imaginatively recreating what is not there. I mean, this is a fact. I encounter this all the time. I talk about certain passages where the whole import of that passage is totally lost on the recording in question. But they know the work, and they know how it's supposed to sound, And so you can go back to that historical recording with huge swaths of missing texture and sonority and timbre and dynamics, and you can imaginatively put it back in and then claim that the performance is stunning and amazing and fabulous because you are adding to what is not there, what should be there. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that. That isn't evil. I mean, it's not a crime to do that. It's some people, in fact, enjoy it more. They like bringing themselves, their imaginative recreation of what they think the artist must have been doing, rather than what they're actually doing or what's actually there, to the table. I am not interested in that process at all. What I hear is what's on the disc, or what is coming through, and no more and no less. Because in my professional capacity as a critic, forget what I like to do as a normal person outside of this. I have to describe what something sounds like, what somebody who does not know the music or does not know the performance is actually going to hear when they put on, the disc, the recording in question, or download, or whatever they do nowadays. I have to describe it accurately. It isn't a question of what I think it might have been or what I think some imaginative listener with a certain amount of knowledge of a work might recreate a performance as. That was an awkward sentence, but you get the point, right? That's the problem here. And so you're going to encounter all kinds of very, very subjective falderall when discussing historical recordings. But I just wanted to sum it all up, and I think give you some sensible guidelines in having this little talk, and say to you, pay attention to what you hear. And if you're learning a work for the first time, or for the first 3 or 4 times, always get a good performance and good sound. And by that, I mean from like the mono LP era forward. I'm not worried about the date. Again, I'm worried about how much of the work you can really hear, so that you can make sensible comparisons, so that you can decide whether an earlier recording has enough information to speak to you, rather than simply taking someone else's word for it and thinking that there must be something wrong with you if you're not hearing what they say you should be hearing. It's never about what someone else says you should be hearing. It's always about what you know that you've heard. But you owe it to yourself. You owe it to yourself to understand and enjoy and learn your way around a piece of music, especially orchestral or a big choral work or an opera or something like that, in a form that allows you to hear the maximum of what the composer intended that you hear, just in terms of the sheer sound of the thing. And then you can start to decide how one performance differs from the other, and which performances are more expressive and which are not, and which ones have unique qualities that speak to you personally. I'm not warning you away from these recordings at all. I'm only suggesting that you come to them forewarned, forearmed, and with genuine knowledge of what the piece of music is and should sound like. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.